In this video, I'll paint and compare a 3D model printed in resin to the same model printed in filament, and I'll show you the differences. It's fairly obvious that 3D printing has changed the miniature wargaming landscape and will continue to do so. If you don't know what 3D printing is, it's the action or process of making a physical object from a three-dimensional digital model, typically by laying down many thin layers of material in succession. It basically allows us to manufacture physical 3D copies of digital designs in our own homes. Generally, you buy an STL file and then you print it with your printer rather than buying like a metal or a resin or a plastic kit from the store and then building that. The two main types of 3D printing that get used in wargaming are resin-based and filament-based. Resin-based printing uses a photoreactive resin and UV light to create the model, incredibly thin layer by layer, to build up the shape of the print. It then needs to be washed so that all the extra stuff gets off and cured so that it hardens up completely. And then once it's all dry, you can paint it. Filament printing uses a spool of filament which is pulled through a hot end, which melts it. Kind of like when you push the glue through a glue gun, that hot tip, all that kind of stuff. And then it basically draws each layer with kind of a robot arm until the model is done. There's no washing or curing with filament. Generally, people use resin printing for figures because the layers are incredibly thin and that makes the detail fidelity very high. You can get amazingly fine detail, as fine, if not in some cases finer, than many plastic miniatures. Filament printing, on the other hand, can't get that amount of fidelity, so it's generally used more for terrain pieces and things like that. The detail isn't nearly as good as resin, but filament printing is much more robust. It's very sturdy and hard to break in comparison, which makes it pretty perfect for terrain pieces, which, frankly, people are a little bit more rough with their terrain pieces than they are with their miniatures. Resin printing can also be a pretty messy process in comparison to most filament printing. Resin is a kind of a sticky, toxic fluid with noxious fumes, and of course the aforementioned washing and curing being needed to finish the pieces. Filament printing, on the other hand, is less dangerous, specifically when printing a filament type like PLA, or polylactic acid, which is a biodegradable plastic made from plant-based stuff. Most folks print terrain with PLA and it doesn't need to be cured or washed or anything. It's ready to prime right after you take it off of the machine. So, resin is for miniatures and filament is for terrain. That's how it is. Well, maybe not. In recent years, as resin printers have gotten higher and higher detail 4K screens, then 8K, and now even 16K screens that are shining the UV light into the goop in the resin vat, filament printers haven't really gotten a ton higher in resolution. The smallest diameter nozzles are 0.1 millimeter, but they seem to clog a lot, evidently, so most people generally use 0.2 millimeter nozzles as their tiniest nozzles. But besides the nozzles, there's actually a lot of other tech factors that have made filament printing better lately. Filament printers used to require a lot of adjusting and kind of tinkering to get set up right. You used to have to prepare the build plate properly to get adhesion, and then you had to constantly recalibrate and all kinds of stuff like that. Nowadays, companies like Bamboo Lab have made filament printers that are nearly plug and play. I made a video about the Bamboo Lab A1 and why I like it. Pachow. And it does an amazing job right out of the box. I've been printing a lot of terrain, and I have had nearly zero problems. But what about miniatures, though? There are companies out there making some STL files for miniatures that are optimized for filament printing, but not a ton. I talked about a cool spaceship combat game called Battlefront Valkyrie recently. Pachow. And the spaceship models included in that game were designed to be printed in filament. The files come with instructions and settings for your printer software, and if you use a 0.2 millimeter nozzle and follow their instructions, I can assure you they come out looking pretty darn good. I printed and painted my own, and they're great. But what about printing STLs that are designed to be printed in resin, but instead using a filament printer? How good can the results be? Spoiler alert, the filament prints, when compared to resin prints, won't fool anybody who looks closely and knows miniatures. If you're a person who does any kind of display painting or even just likes to do kind of better than tabletop painting, you'll be able to see the difference when they're in your hands, right? But what about when they're on the tabletop? Will you notice the difference when printing miniatures for tabletop play? I decided to try and find out. I found a cool robot STL that I wanted to print over at my mini factory, and I bought the file. Link is in the description below if you want to get it yourself. And I got ready to print it in both formats. That was the idea. It's 28mm scale, but it's a big robot, probably about 4 inches high or so. I've seen other folks doing videos about printing miniatures in filament, but I rarely saw videos where the miniatures were of about, that size, roughly the height of an older kind of pre-Primaris dreadnought, right? Also, I don't usually see people comparing prints of the same model in resin and filament in their videos, so I wanted to. The file came in both pre-supported and unsupported versions. Unsupported is needed for printing miniatures in filament, I'm pretty sure. The pre-supported STL files are generally designed for resin printing. The pieces are kind of held at certain angles to help hide the tiny little layer lines even more, and the supports are designed to make the separation of them in resin very easy, but it's not necessarily set up that way so you can just print it FDM style, filament style. Resin supports and filament supports are done quite differently, and pre-supported miniatures are usually designed to be printed in resin. I sent off the pre-supported files to my good friend Dave to print them in resin for me. He's turning his 3D printing into a side business, and it's called bottleandspool.com. Check it down in the description for the link and to get a quote from him if you want to. He does great work. I then set to printing a filament version of the same model that I sent to Dave, but I had to use the unsupported files and then use Bamboo Lab slicing software to add in the tree supports, the supports. There's 2 different types of supports in that particular thing, and I usually go with the tree supports. They seem to work a little better for me. At this point, I kind of discovered an issue. I needed to decide on printing each part separately, each with its own supports and all that kind of stuff. Multiples on one plate, potentially, but still each piece separate, or potentially build the entire robot virtually in the software, putting all the parts together virtually and then printing that all as one piece. I decided to build the model virtually in the slicing software and then add supports to that shape and then print that. I'm not sure if it was the best play for this particular model. Honestly, I'm no expert, but it seemed right at the time. Let me know in the comments down below if I would have been smarter to print and support each piece separately and then glue it all together later. Building the model virtually in the slicer software was, I'll admit, kind of time consuming. It probably took nearly as long to build virtually as it did to build the resin version that I got from Dave later. Like I said, I used tree supports in the Bamboo Lab slicer software to support the model that I virtually built, and the model came out pretty great with the 0.2mm nozzle and some settings tweaks from Fat Dragon Games. However, it was then time to remove all of the tree supports on the filament print, and that took quite a while as well. I used a needle nose pliers to reef on these things and kind of pull all the bits apart and all that kind of stuff, and it worked okay, but the undersides of a lot of places in this model, and admittedly the STL was probably a bit of a torture test for filament printing, but a lot of the undersides were a bit of a mess and kind of hairy, even with the supports. Once I had both models based, I primed them with Army Painter Air Black Matte Primer through my airbrush. Then I did some kind of colored zenithal highlighting with Army Painter Air paints to make them both kind of a bluey turquoise color with kind of some volume, highlights and shades and stuff like that. And then at this point, well, the filament print doesn't look great close up, of course, especially when you really get, it close to your face and focus on the overhanging bits and all that stuff. However, if you just put it on the table as if you were going to play a game, it doesn't look terrible. At a few feet, you might miss that they're different at first glance. So then I started detailing them at my painting table. I was going to treat both models the same to mainly show how different paint techniques look on the two different materials and to highlight the differences. I started with some dry brushing to do some sort of simple edge highlighting and to make certain details of the models pop. It worked great on the edges of both models, but the edges are sharper and more defined on the resin model. Also, the dry brushing did have a tendency to pop some of the filament lines in the robot's smooth areas a bit as well. Then I decided to accentuate some of the edges of the robots even a little bit more and do a standard, edge highlighting after the dry brush was done. Again, the edges to the model are rougher on the filament version, so the paint kind of catches in those rougher areas kind of randomly, so you don't get quite as smooth of an edge highlight as you do on the resin version. But again, at a distance, this doesn't look too bad. You can't expect display painting results out of filament prints at this time. But this model looks pretty good on the tabletop as long as you don't look like, really hard. I wanted to do some weathering, but I didn't want it to be rust, I didn't think, I thought maybe the armor parts of this robot are some sort of like high-tech ceramic or something, so I used a sponge to stipple on some lighter blue in places to look like the ceramic surface had been scuffed, but otherwise mostly unharmed. I'm pretty sure ceramic doesn't rust, so using this lighter color kind of still gives it some variation and a little bit of visual texture and makes it look a bit weathered. It's an easy technique that I usually use with a rust-colored paint, but it worked well here for this effect and seems no different on the filament print than it did on the resin print. I then used Army Painter Speed Paint Grim Black to color a ton of stuff black on the model, and it worked equally well on both prints. I wanted all these parts to be metallic at some point, so laying down a layer of black first made a lot of sense to me. I also usually use a lot of washes on my models, especially like big unifying washes, but in this case, I wanted the majority of my model to look a bit cleaner and new, and I kind of thought that the layer lines in the filament model, might be accentuated with an all-over wash, so I just used the overall wash in some areas that I wanted to darken. I painted most of the black parts silver with some dry brushing and stuff like that, highlighted some of the silver with kind of a brighter silver and regular brush, did the basing and stuff like that, finished them all up, and when I look at them close in my hands, I put them up in front of my face, it's still pretty obvious which one is which, right? Like, with decent lighting and holding them like a foot or more from your face, the filament one is still obviously lower detail and a bit stringy in the overhangs and stuff like that. And with this macro lens on my Twitch streaming setup, it's pretty painfully obvious. Resin is way better than filament. However, most people don't play games with the models like a foot from their face. At least, no one that I know does, I don't think. Usually, the models are 2 or 3 or more feet away when you play, depending on how big your board might be. And from those distances, this robot looks pretty good. Building it was a little difficult in the slicer software, and the supports were a little annoying to remove, but it only took about $1 of filament to print, $1. Speaking of the supports, I ripped off a part I didn't mean to the first time, so I printed a new one, to replace it because I ripped that piece off, but then I experimented on the screw-up. Using the same Army Painter Fanatic Dark Rust Effects paint that I used a few weeks back on my Trench Crusade Anchorite Shrine, Pachow, I decided to see how it would work to kind of hide the layer lines on my screwed up robot print. And actually, it worked pretty well. Like, stippling it on with a short, bristled, domed dry brush really worked a treat. I'd like to think that it'd be neat to put this stuff on before priming the model even, so that I can then prime the model over the texture and then put like a color over the top of everything that isn't, say, rust color, right? And then kind of see how that all turns out. I have some smaller 3D printed terrain pieces that actually might work perfectly for this. In the future, I want to try this again, but with even smaller models. This robot being so big might give extra benefit to the filament version because the details were basically larger on the big robot. I'd like to try like a regular 28mm person-sized model next to see if it still works out like this test did. My suspicion is it'll look a bit worse in comparison, but I don't know, maybe it won't. Also, if you've been trying this for a while, printing regular size miniatures and stuff like that in Filament, and you have any tips or tricks, or if you have an opinion about whether I should have printed the Filament version in separate pieces or whatever, let me know down below. So in conclusion, you won't trick anyone into thinking the Filament print is resin, especially within like a foot or so. But on the tabletop in a game, it doesn't look half bad, and it's perfectly usable for gaming. Do you agree? Would you play with a model that looked like the Filament print that I showed here, or would you only use resin-printed models for your tabletop games? Let us all know what you think down in the comments below. And if you would do some two-dimensional depressmentation of the like button, I'd be three-dimensionally happy. And, hit subscribe while you're down there too if you're in the mood. Why not? Thanks for watching.